coming from the Federal Communications Commission goes into effect on June 11th, so it hasn't actually happened, but it will happen. There is some resistance in our Congress to the decision to abandon net neutrality. Let me first of all remind you that the problem of net neutrality in the U.S. May be different from the problems here in Korea, in South Korea. So let me explain what happened in the U.S. and then we can compare. In the 1990s in the United States, there were 8,000 internet service providers. 8,000. The way you got to them was to dial up through the telephone system to get to a modem bank in order to interact with the internet. Towards the end of the 20th century, broadband technology came along. Cable modems, optical fiber modems, and digital subscriber loops. But those technologies required physical equipment to be placed in each person's home or business. So you had to have a cable modem, or you had to have an optical fiber modem, or you had to have a DSL terminator in order to get broadband access. There were very few choices for the Americans at that point. Typically, if you lived in the rural parts of the United States, you had no choice at all. There was no broadband available, and it is still a problem. So there's zero. In the suburban parts of the U.S., sometimes you had a choice of one broadband service provider, a telephone company or a cable company, but only one. Even though there existed multiple companies offering the service, as a consumer, you didn't get very much choice. And in the central parts of the U.S. and the urban parts, you typically had a choice of two, a cable company and a telephone company. So there was not very much choice for each consumer, each subscriber. In the as the broadband services continued to penetrate, the cable companies and the telephone companies began to add services in addition to broadband internet. In some cases, cable companies started by offering video service, then they added internet service. The telephone companies started with telephone service, then they added internet service. All of them began to move into vertical markets. So in the US, the telephone companies and the cable companies are both supplying video service in addition to internet. Here's where the net neutrality issue becomes prominent. If you were a cable company and you had subscribers who were subscribing to video service, and you noticed that a competing video service was being offered to your subscriber through your internet channel, you might be tempted to interfere with the internet channel to prevent the other competitor from offering useful video service to your customer. This is called an anti-competitive behavior. And the Federal Communications Commission recognized this problem and said, we will adopt a set of rules that will inhibit that kind of bad behavior because it's harmful to consumer interest. Well, something else also happened in the FCC. The cable companies and the telephone companies in the United States operate under something called the Telecommunications Act. It has different titles that regulate the cable companies and the telephone companies differently. The cable companies started out as just video service companies, and the telephone companies started out as a telephone company. So they had different regulatory regimes in the Telecom Act. They came complaining to the FCC saying, we both offer internet service, but we are regulated differently. And so the FCC of the time said, oh, well, we'll fix that. We'll just make internet an unregulated service. So they moved it to what is called Title I in the Telecom Act. That meant there was no regulation at all associated with internet because they had declared it to be unregulated. Now remember, we have this other set of net neutrality agreements, or at least recommendations, to prevent anti-competitive behavior. The day came when the Federal Communication Commission tried to enforce the net neutrality rules. And when they tried to do that, the company that they were trying to to regulate, said, you can't do that. Our internet service is unregulated. So there was a court case that went all the way up to the US Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said to the FCC, you decided internet was an unregulated service, you have no grounds for enforcing net neutrality. At that point, the FCC at the time, under Tom Wheeler, moved internet back to Title II, a telecom, and said it is a telecommunications service and it is regulated. The present FCC decided to reverse that. So there we are today without any means for protecting consumers from anti-competitive behavior of internet service providers. So you can tell where I sit on this. I think that we need a title in the American Telecom Act that speaks specifically to internet and introduces the net neutrality rules, nothing else. None of the complexity of Title II or Title VI, the cable, just net neutrality rules in a new Telecom Act. The problem we have in the United States is that our Congress is dysfunctional and is having a lot of trouble passing any legislation. And so the likelihood of getting a title into the Telecom Act to treat internet net neutrality is going to be remote at the moment. That's the current situation. It's not a good situation to be in because of the loss of protection for consumer interest. What I don't know is how relevant that whole scenario is here in South Korea, where you seem to have a substantial amount of broadband service available on a competitive basis.